Good afternoon, everybody. We are now opening the fifth, actually, session of this remarkable conference. It was really inspiring, thoughtful, very informative. And after trying to put together questions that pertains to the science of ecology and our very presence on this planet Earth, moving to questions of theology and to questions of ethics, we are now going to listen to activists who really have made a difference in the last few decades, how to bring the message that we have explored throughout the day to the Jewish community at large. So I will introduce all five of them first, and then I will pose the question and we'll go question by questions, and all five will respond to the question at a time. So I will start with Rabbi Fred Scherlinder Dobb, who has been a rabbi at Adat Shalom Reconstructionist congregation in Bethesda, Maryland for his entire career. A 1998 graduate of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College and a Wexner Fellow, Rabbi Dobb earned also a Doctor of Ministry from Wesley Theological Seminary in 2009. He currently chairs the Coalition of the Environment and Jewish Life and serves on the National Board of Interfaith Power and Light as the past president of the Washington Board of Rabbis, as well as a former chair of the Maryland, DC, and Northern Virginia Interfaith Power and Light affiliates. Rabbi Dobb writes and educates widely on Judaism and social and environmental justice. Our second speaker, from whom you've also heard through the conference, and she posed wonderful question, is Dr. Mirle Goldsmith. She's an environmental psychologist, educator, and activist. She's an expert on how to change human behavior to solve environmental problems and how to build a sustainable future. Dr. Goldsmith co-founded Jewish Earth Alliance, a grassroots network raising a moral voice on climate change to the United States Congress. That's where policy is made, presumably. Prior to her current work, Dr. Goldstein has been associated also, I should say, with Chazon, Jewish Lab for Sustainability, which is the largest Jewish environmental organization. Our third speaker, Rabbi Jennie Rosenn, or Rosenn, I guess it should be pronounced, is the founder and CEO of Dayenu, a Jewish call to climate action. This is a new organization mobilizing the American Jewish community to confront the climate crisis with spiritual audacity and bold political action. She has spent more than 2 decades leading a Jewish nonprofit or several Jewish nonprofit organizations, advocating for social change and creating dynamic new initiatives at the heart of Jewish social justice movement. Rabbi Rosenn was ordained by the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, and she was also a Wexner Graduate Fellow. She has twice been named by Forward as one of the 50 most influential Jews in America. Our fourth speaker is Rabbi Sophia Motzkin-Rubenstein. Rabbi Ruhi Sophia Motzkin-Rubenstein, who is the rabbi of Temple Beth Israel Center for Jewish Life in Eugene, Oregon. Prior to her rabbinical training, also at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, she worked as a Jewish environmental educator with Teva Learning Alliance. That's a very important environmental educational organization. Rabbi Rubenstein continues to use her pulpit and public profile to advocate for environmental responsibility. And last but not least is our own Phoenix-centered, Phoenix resident, Rabbi Shmuly Yanklowitz, who is the spiritual leader of Valley Bet Midrash here in Phoenix. Valley Bet Midrash brings to the Valley Jewish educators, scholars, and thought leaders whose lectures cover the entire scope of Jewish history and offer deep understanding of ethics that strengthen the Jewish community. Rabbi Yanklowitz holds 3 rabbinical ordinations, one from Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, one from Rabbi Shlomo Riskin in Efrat, Israel, one from Rabbi Nathan Lopez Cardozo of Jerusalem. He also earned an MA from Harvard in Leadership and Psychology, another MA in Jewish Philosophy from Yeshiva University, and a PhD from Columbia University in Epistemology and Moral Development. Rabbi Yanklowitz is the author of numerous books. I'll just mention a few that are relevant to our interests here. The Book of Jonah, Social Justice Commentary from 2018. He has another book called The Soul of Activists, Spirituality and Social Change from 2019. He has a book on Jewish veganism and vegetarianism, offering new directions in that area. He has a book on kashrut and Jewish food ethics, and a particular book that is of interest to me, especially for what I'm working on right now on postmodern Jewish ethics, emerging social justice paradigms. So if this is not sufficient, I should also mention that he's the founder and leader of Shamayim Va'aretz and yet another environmental organization. So these are our panelists, and I would like to ask, by asking them to talk about each one, to talk about how have you been involved in environmental activism? Tell us something about your specific contribution to Jewish environmentalism. So we'll start basically with self-introduction. Rabbi Dobb, please.
Right. So Tzimtzum is one of the great teachings about not taking up more space than you need to. So a bunch of rabbis and Jewish educators with 3 minutes each for these questions will be interesting. The power of story and narrative that's been pointed to, each of us have stories that could fill this. I had the luck of being on the ground floor thanks to the pioneers like Ellen. I was actually the youngest attendee of the first ever conference that she and Shomrei Adama put together in 1989 because I just right place and right time, budding interest that then turned into a year off from college in 1990 across the country, speaking and learning and teaching in turn. And I've been active ever since for 30 years, most of it with COJL, Coalition on the Environment and Jewish Life. Also a number of interfaith projects, going back to a group, Religious Witness for the Earth, where I first met Ruhi, and I'd overlapped way back in 1990 with Mirele. We're all one beautiful small world of folks here, and through Interfaith Power and Light. So I would say my own contributions have been in 3 main ways. One is networking people and ideas, and we're blessedly to the point of a large enough movement where no one knows everyone anymore. That tipping point just came in the last 10 years or so, and I'm thrilled. So I can retire now. The second is popularizing Jewish environmental thought. Not a lot of original scholarship, but a lot of packaging for popular understanding, what will fly on our pulpit, but also in the common press, Moment Magazine kind of awareness in the broader Jewish world. And finally, the multi-faith work. There's a growing number of rabbis who have taken leadership positions with Interfaith Power and Light, with Green Faith, with the National Religious Partnership for the Environment, and even the ones doing full-time, like Jennie running Dayenu, is constantly in coalitional work with non-Jewish partners, Mirele as well. And there's something really sacred about taking that awareness of what we can do with our teachings to the next level.
Great. Let's move on in the same order. Mirele, please.
Well, a peak moment for me in my Jewish environmental career was at the People's Climate March in 2014. Some of you may recall that March was convened in advance of a summit of global leaders at the UN. And it eventually was the largest environmental or climate action ever in the history of the world. But I was involved with mobilizing the Jewish community for that as part of an interfaith coalition. And on that morning, we had a whole block to ourselves, 10,000 people of faith thousands of Jews who came with shofarot. It was right before Rosh Hashanah, blowing their shofarot to call for action on climate. And just to go back a little bit, at the time I was working for Chazon with the Jewish Greening Fellowship, which was a program to mobilize Jewish communities around action on the climate crisis. And what I found was that most Jewish communities, wanted to start with individual action, helping people to purchase renewable energy, or I think at that time it was probably CFL bulbs, compost and those kind of things. And then maybe move on to some communal actions to do with managing their facilities. And we really need, I knew even then that we really need action on all three levels, the individual level, the community level, and the systemic level. But how were we going to get people to move along that to the level of advocacy for the real policy changes that we need? And what I learned was that community is the key to that. What we can do as individuals is a drop in the bucket, but if we add it up, if we do it together, we can fill that bucket. And as a psychologist, I know that how do we really get people to do those things and then to add them up? It's all about social norms and changing communities. And when individuals take those simple individual actions, it changes them. And I saw this in that program, and it turns them into, gives them that willingness to be involved in advocacy. And if you want to learn more about that, I really recommend Under the Influence, Putting Peer Pressure to Work by Robert Frank. If you're not sure that I'm right, try reading that book. Anyway, so after several years of these communities being involved in the Jewish Greening Fellowship, when it came time for the People's Climate March, they were ready and willing to get involved in advocacy. And that really convinced me that the key is the community level and working with communities. And to get them involved in advocacy, we need to give those tools to make it easy. And so my contribution, I think, has, it's all led to what I'm doing now, which is to make it easier for communities to engage in advocacy. And that's what the Jewish Earth Alliance does. It provides those tools to make it easy for Jewish communities to be involved in lobbying Congress.
Great, that's a wonderful summary. So Rabbi Rosenn, please go ahead and tell us about your work.
Thank you. I want to just thank you for centering activism at an academic conference, which is not a given, and really speaks to your leadership. And honored to be here with Fred and Mirele and Ellen, who was in the last panel, all longtime environmental leaders who've been an inspiration to me and have been raising their voices and organizing for decades. My own involvement in environmental activism really started when I was a program officer at the Nathan Cummings Foundation and had the opportunity to support some of the early efforts like COJOL, and also to be part of the Green Environment Fund in Israel, which was really starting to grow an environmental movement there in Israel. But having said that, the core of my work the past 30 years, and really the heart of my rabbinate, has been around mobilizing the American Jewish community to address issues of social and economic justice. And for me, that largely meant people-centered activism, poverty, immigrants and refugees, hunger, human rights. And I think mistakenly, like many, I for a long time thought of the environment as something out there and not connected to people and civil and human and social political rights. So without spending our limited time on my own awakening, I'll just say that a few years ago, I really realized in a profound and much deeper way, the way in which the climate crisis is the existential crisis of our time, and that without major change, we are headed for climate collapse in the fairly near term. And I also realized that the climate crisis at its core is a social, economic, and racial justice issue. It's about people. It's about who is bearing the brunt of climate change already and who will be most severely impacted in the future. And at the same time, was starting to have a lot of conversations with friends and colleagues about the way that the American Jewish community was not yet kind of fully mobilized to confront the crisis at the scale that's needed. As you heard from Mirele and Fred, and we'll hear more from others, there was amazing work happening. There continues to be great work happening, and we need more. for the Jewish community to fully show up in all of our people in power and play a critical role in the larger national climate movement and in turn the global climate movement. So at the end of April, in partnership with many of the people here and many others, we launched Dayenu, a Jewish call to climate action. And our mission is sort of the big picture to secure a just, livable, sustainable world for all people for generations to come by building a multi-generational Jewish movement that's confronting the climate crisis, as you said, Hava, with spiritual audacity and bold political action. So rooted in Jewish values and experience and spirit, we're mobilizing Jewish support for climate solutions, building our collective power, that collectivity that Mirele spoke of, with national and global movements, and raising up a spiritual, religious, and moral voice. So I'll just close really quickly with one example of what that looks like. This fall, Dayenu's Chutzpah 2020 campaign to get out the vote is one example of that. So we mobilized more than 800 Jews across the country. We were joined by 43 other Jewish organizations, including many on this panel, and together reached out to more than 750,000 climate concerned voters, calling on them to elect leaders who have the chutzpah, who have the audacity to take bold action on climate. So through grassroots organizing and Dayenu circles in formation, connecting Jewish institutions to climate policy through our Washington hub, and lots of partnerships with Jewish environmental, faith, and secular climate organizations, building the kind of Jewish climate movement that this moment in history really requires.
Yes, very, very important and well said. Rabbi Rubenstein, would you like to help us see the problem from your particular perspective? I understand you do a lot of work with people, again, changing and responding to how they perceive the world.
I want to start by saying it's such an honor to be here in the presence of those giants upon whose shoulders I stand. I was 4 years old at the time of that first Shomrei Adama conference. And I met both Ellen Bernstein and Fred Scherlinder Dobb when I was in college. Ellen Bernstein spoke to my Hillel. Fred was with part of Religious Witness for the Earth, one of the organizers of an interfaith climate rescue walk across the state of Massachusetts that I participated in over a spring break, walking across Massachusetts. It happened to be during a blizzard, advocating for climate change, climate conscious policy. That was fun. And as Dr. Samuelson noted in my bio, I wound up working for many seasons as a Teva educator, trying to inculcate largely urban, largely day school attending Jewish students about love of nature and the necessity of connecting to and protecting our natural world. And now I'm one of those remote outpost retail rabbis in Eugene, Oregon, serving a shul that is far from the centers of advocacy or political action, although Eugene is actually a hub of environmental activism and legal work. So Eugene is the home of the Environmental Law Alliance Worldwide, ELAW, as well as the home of Our Children's Trust, which has been doing really innovative legal work, suing various governments on a public trust doctrine. And so from where I sit, I experience both the necessity that others have mentioned of the communal level work. So in that regard, I've built a green team at our synagogue, and in a couple of years, TBI won second place. Temple Beth Israel is the synagogue I serve, won second place in our Eugene carbon-free climate challenge. But I also am very concerned by many speakers before me have talked about the importance of narrative and the narratives of what we think of as victory and what we think of as loss. And I love how Dr. Unbar earlier spoke this morning about the seductiveness of denial, despair, and delusion. I've been very concerned about the ways that our narratives push us into those directions. And as I work with and meet so many activists and environmental advocates, I have become particularly concerned with how do we we tell the story of what we're doing, not just externally, but to ourselves, to each other, in ways that keep us in the conversation for the long haul, even through the over and over again defeat and the loss of what is already lost. And we've had a lot of practice. We've needed to practice at that, especially in the last 4 years. So a few years ago, I started essentially a faith support group for activists and advocates, the leaders of the local 350 group and the leaders of E-Law and leaders from Our Children's Trust to gather in my, well, it was in my living room pre-COVID, just to share some meditation and to share spiritual support and to share the reminder of what it means to be in this work over the long haul, through the despair, through the loss, to understand this work as lifetime work that is beyond the particulars of a given victory or defeat. So that is where I have been particularly putting my preaching and my writing. I write an op-ed for my local regional newspaper once a month, and I write about climate, and I write about what this moment spiritually demands of us.
Great. And again, Rabbi Yanklowitz, please tell us about your work. We cannot hear you, Rabbi Yanklowitz.
Okay, are we on?
Yeah, please start.
Okay, sorry about that. Thank you, Professor Samuelson, and thank you, Lisa, for the invite. I love these conferences you put together, and it's great to be with colleagues and friends, Rabbi Fred, Rabbi Rosenn, Rabbi Dr. Goldstein, all of you, to be inspired by teachers and friends. And I inhabit a few different spaces, one of the pluralistic social justice spaces, and also some Orthodox spaces. And I'm reflecting these days on our holidays that we're in between now, where it is so clear who the individual is who creates change, right? When Esther is inside the palace, you can actually see the moment where the tables turn. And now we're moving towards Moshe and seeing him also entering the palace and where the change comes from. And what's so fascinating about that is that now in a pandemic, when we see more and more humbly how interconnected we are, how decentralized change occurs, and we reflect on what we've learned over this last year and how it moves forward to the work we have to do in climate change, we look for those superheroes who are inside the palace. And not only can we not necessarily find those people, but we can't find that palace because there is no palace to turn to when we're dealing with globally interconnected challenges. And that uncertainty in our time can move us to hide within fundamentalism, or it can move us to hide within apathy and hedonism when change feels so difficult and we feel so powerful and powerless at the same time. And so I'm reflecting a lot on how we just continue to inspire change without there being heroism, without there being a palace, and how we continue to stay in the game when we can't always track success in a linear fashion. For me, I would just point to two things briefly. One is in a religious traditionalist framework to think about the ethics of consumption, work I've been involved with for the last 15 years, where it's very complicated in my view to make a bridge from Jewish text to legislation as we see it today in many regards, but not very hard when it comes to personal consumption. Personal consumption feels easy, especially given the richness of our traditional resources around food. And so in regards to my boycotts over the years with agri-processors and with flams, and really the ethics of the kosher industry and rethinking our texts in relationship to consumption in general, that has been one arena that I've tried to play a small role in. And secondly, as I'll talk about in our next question, through Shemayim, advocating for veganism throughout the Jewish community.
All right, great. So what we've seen is that you all work in complementary ways, but you actually go about your work in very distinctive way. So the second question would be, what is the task of Jewish environmentalism? How are you going to green Judaism? Now, it's very possible that we cannot agree on, there's not going to be just one way. Each one has to do it in his or her own way. But let's focus specifically about the task. So maybe we'll start again with you, Rabbi Dobb.
Great. So the task, in Judaism, we always look for a catchphrase from long ago that encapsulates it. It is from the Aleinu prayer, L'taken olam b'malchut Shaddai, to repair the world under dominion of the all. And that, of course, breaks down into all the constituent steps: building awareness, sensitivity, solidarity, and I would even say stick-to-itiveness, because so much of the challenge is that, and really the task, as I see it right now, is to drive the greater sense of urgency and personal connection. There have been data points, PRRI and others, that show that Jews know the settled science and rank highest in polls about understanding that the climate crisis is real and it's bad. And this applies to the environmental challenges that don't fit neatly under the climate umbrella as well. However, when it comes to questions like, is it already affecting me or those around me, or will it soon, Jews rank quite low. And that has a whole bunch of reasons, including disproportionate privilege, which is far from widespread among us, but it's there. We need to get that urgency. We need to get that we are part of one larger body politic, social body, and then use the prodigious connections and chutzpah that our tradition can marshal in order to be at the head and not at the tail of all of this. And of late, the way that I want to green Judaism is by returning to those virtues, as Roger Gottlieb said in the opening session. Musar is an underused resource for this. It's the piece of Judaism where ethics, spirit, and practice all meet, or midot, these attributes. So, for example, if we really focused on kavod, honor, one of the classic categories, the inherent value and weight of everyone and everything around us, we would then work harder to protect Earth and vulnerable people. It's just a logical follow-up from taking seriously what tradition offers us. If we really focused on anava, humility, which is defined in Musar as taking up the right amount of space, then it would instantly be incumbent on us in an almost halachic way to soberly calculate our footprint and then radically shrink it and redouble our organizing efforts. So to green Judaism really means to bring out what already inheres in Judaism and get it to the place that it needs to be, given the realities of 2021.
Yes, very well said. Yeah, Dr. Goldsmith, please.
Well, it's an honor for me to follow my own rabbi, Rabbi Dobb. So I'll take a cue from him and start with my own quote from Isaiah. Lo tohu v'raha lashevet yitzara. God did not make this world to be desolate, but instead to be inhabited sustainably. I'm thinking of David Wallace Wells' book, The Uninhabitable Earth. That is not a Jewish earth. I think it goes without saying, but perhaps it's been said already all day today, that it's a Jewish imperative for us to take care of the earth. And if you're wondering about the mitzvah of taking care of the earth, everyone should definitely read the wonderful Teshuvah by Rabbi Nina Cardin and Avram Reisner, who I believe are on this call, for the conservative movement, on the mitzvah of Yishuvo Ha'olam. If you don't have that on your reading list, put it on your reading list now. So Judaism is green. The point now is that we have the solutions to turn this around. And what do we need? We need the political will. So our task as Jews is to mobilize and organize Jews to help create that political will and turn this thing around. I told you earlier about my participation in the People's Climate March. Well, that started when I went to the first meeting that was called for organizers of the march. And we were all very excited when about 200 people showed up in New York City for that very first meeting just a few months before the march was to take place. And some amazing organizers got up and spoke about environmental justice and about what it means to organize the labor community. And then they did a wonderful thing. They said, we can create the framework for the march, but you have to get the people there. Turn to the person next to you and tell them what you're going to do. They put us all on the spot. And I turned to the person next to me and I thought, what could I do? I could organize Jews. That's who I know. I know Jews. And that's what I did. I want every Jew to hear that call the way I heard it. I want every Jew to be involved, the grassroots of the Jewish community to get involved in this. And when I speak about this, I talk about Moses, that when God called to Moses out of the burning bush, Moses didn't want to go to Pharaoh. He said he wasn't up to it. And in fact, he wasn't really that great a leader. Pharaoh didn't listen to him at first, that's right. And the people didn't trust him either. He needed a lot of help from Aaron, from Miriam, from Yitro, from Joshua. But he became the greatest leader that we ever had. So every Jew has the capacity to do something and make a contribution.
Absolutely. Yes, Rabbi Rosenn, please.
So I think the question following up on Mirele is not so much how do we green Judaism? Judaism is pretty green, but how do we bring the experience of the Jewish people, our history, our wisdom, our teaching, our faith, our spirit, our song, how do we bring that to this moment and to the movement? How do we create a spiritually rooted Jewish climate movement that's coming together with other communities, centering justice, and taking the kind of bold systemic action on climate that is what we need if we're going to avert the most devastating impacts of the climate crisis? And I say avert the most devastating impacts because it's not about preventing the climate crisis. It's here. We painfully know that to be true. How do we build a just, livable, and sustainable world? So I want to break those elements down a little bit and start with centering justice. The impacts fall of the climate crisis, and this is something that Fred just said, fall disproportionately on those who've been historically marginalized. So it's a force multiplier in some ways, right? It exacerbates historical inequities, even as it impacts everyone. And I actually think that the COVID pandemic has given us a sort of devastating, painful, but powerful model of it affects everyone, but not everyone equally. So in all the work that we do to address the climate crisis, we need to ensure that we're centering justice. And I think that the Jewish values undergirding our work need to expand beyond the classics, right? Shomrei Adamah, protecting the earth, Bal Tashchit, prohibition of waste, central, but it's also Tirdof Tzedek, the pursuit of justice. It's also Shomer Ger Yatom V'Almanah, protecting the most vulnerable. Confronting the climate crisis, secondly, in a spiritually rooted way. And I really appreciate what you were saying, Ruhi, about the need to not only notice how interconnected we are, but to draw on and support one another in the spiritual and emotional and psychological struggle of this moment. And I hope we'll have a chance to talk a little bit more about that. I also think that historically, it means highlighting, we're giving an opportunity right now, exacerbated by the pandemic and the economic fallout, to re-envision and rebuild a different kind of future. And as Jews, we have faced existential crisis and disruption and destruction throughout history. And we've not only survived, but we've thrived often by re-envisioning and rebuilding something different. Each time we've had to have a new kind of existence. And we can track that to the Exodus, we can track that to the destruction of the temple, right? An incredible paradigm of complete societal and paradigmatic transformation, right? The shift from sacrifices on the temple altar to the practice of prayer and deeds, Judaism as we know it now. So we're living in a moment like that. And encountering the climate crisis from a place of spirit means recognizing and honoring the way in which, yes, it is profoundly overwhelming. And lo b'shamayim hi, it is not in heaven. It is not beyond us. we have the capacity to reimagine and reinvent. And in fact, we have the chiyuv, the obligation to do so that we can create a world that is just and livable and sustainable for all of us for generations to come.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. I'm going to say amen after each one of your of your speeches, because we're all on the same page here. Rabbi Rubenstein, please.
So I want to say first, yes, to what everyone has said, especially to what Rabbi Rosenn just said. And that checks off some of the things I was going to say. So that's great. I also want to talk, another thing that I think Jewish environmentalism particularly offers and needs to offer, and I know Dr. Gottlieb mentioned this briefly, but I want to flesh it out, is the concept of teshuvah. And by teshuvah, I mean our capacity to understand that the future and that our own failures are not inevitable, that we are neither in a state of optimism or despair about our own capacity. The very notion that human beings can do teshuvah is predicated on this idea that we are full of human potential. And it is a functionally amoral potential, right? We can do great harm, we can do great good. And as the Rambam says, I'm actually going to just pull up the quote and share it. It is necessary for each person to behold ourselves throughout the whole year in a light of being evenly balanced between innocence and guilt, and to behold as if the whole world functions similarly, such that each and every one of our deeds has the potential to tip the balance. So I think this notion of teshuvah is very powerful because it also guides us through the inadequacy, right? Every year at the Yamim Noraim, at the high holidays, we sit and we beat our chests and we say out loud how inadequate we are to the task of making the world better, and yet we commit ourselves to the work nonetheless. So I think this notion that we are full of potential and that inadequate as we are, every little step that we can do towards the good has some cosmic significance is a really necessary notion for an environmental ethic nowadays. So more and more, I am framing our environmental work in the language of teshuvah. And I also want to say, and I get a kick out of the fact that Rabbi Rosenn's organization is called Dayenu, and I know it's being used in a very different framework than the one I'm about to mention. But I think the idea of Dayenu is really important in that, as we know, so much has already been lost. We're not going to save the world bigadol. We're not going to save everything. Some things are already lost. Some cultures are already lost. Some areas are already lost. Some species are already lost. And yet we have to love and save what can yet be saved. We have to do the work. And for that, I find, I'm going to share my screen again, the theology of Dayenu, what we recite on Pesach, very powerful, which is this theology that we give thanks for each step of a long, arduous, and nearly impossible task. But at each step along the way where there is any sort of victory, no matter how incomplete, we have not only the right, but I would actually say a spiritual obligation to celebrate it. And I think that's a concept that a particular Jewish environmentalism can and should offer the world as well. So, like Rabbi Rosenn, I agree that we don't need to green Judaism, it's already there. But I think that certain of these ideas that are already inherent in Judaism, we need to apply to our greening work within Judaism and beyond the Jewish community. We tend to talk about teshuvah for racial injustice or teshuvah for the environment as if we're applying this concept to something that it isn't already embedded into. So that's what I want to offer.
Yes, let's hear from Rabbi Shmuly, and then I will pose the next question in which I will highlight some of the challenges. Go ahead, Rabbi Yanklowitz.
Yeah, very, very moving. Thank you so much. Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz of blessed memory was asked recently before his passing what do you think is the most important Jewish value? And he could have said something that would have automatically resonated with most of us, like love or compassion or justice. And he said consistency. Consistency. That if something matters to you, that you live it consistently. And going off Rabbi Fred's point about Musar, I think that we have not actualized the midah, the trait of tamidiyut, the trait of living. We want spontaneity, we want to live fresh and new and reinvent ourselves. And with all of that goodness, how to live rooted in the consistency of the work, where movements fade after a day, after a week, after a month. It's so hard to keep movements afloat. And I think this movement in particular, the need for that consistency. And I see my work here as very unpopular, because my work here is really going after meat and dairy and eggs. And this is very threatening to people. I have found that few things are more threatening to people than going after the food they love. And for me, this is tamidiyut. This is the consistency, because it's about every day, every meal, every snack, our fridge, what we buy all the time. And, you know, a recent study came out of researchers at University of Oxford that was published in journal Science that said eating a vegan diet could be the single best way to reduce your environmental impact on the earth, finding that cutting meat and dairy products from our diet could reduce an individual's carbon footprint from food up to 73%. And if everyone stopped eating these foods, we'd find that a global farmland use could be reduced by 75%, an area equivalent to the size of US, China, Australia, and the EU combined. That meat and dairy production is responsible for 60% of agriculture's greenhouse gas emissions. And as to quote them, it is far bigger than cutting down on your flights or buying an electric car. And so this is really hard work to stay in that fight, because people will tune out when you say plant-based meals or veganism. But to me, it feels like when it comes to tamidiyut and the trait of the consistency of trying to live this, it's every bite we take.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. Maybe I would use the word perseverance instead, and not just consistency. So I like the fact that you raised some challenges, because I think that this panel, the panel seems to take for granted, yes, Judaism is green, there's no problem, and we just need to do the work. But as a person who started that 20 years ago, I do believe that we have to recognize the challenges, both political challenges, social challenges, but also within the textual tradition itself. Our very textuality has been a challenge. Just remember the essay that Stephen Schwarzschild published in 1984. 1984, when he talked about the unnatural Jew, he was critiquing the environmental movement which just started. So the question for all of you is, what are some of the major challenges to environmental activism within the Jewish community and in the society at large, from however you want to present it? Rabbi Yanklowitz, you already presented one challenge, the fact that people refuse to become vegan, so it's very hard for them, vegan or vegetarian. Let's hear about some other challenges. Who would like to start offering some other challenges?
I'd actually like
go ahead.
To start by challenging my dear friend and colleague Shmuly and bringing a little bit of controversy, because I think one of the challenges is that we focus so much on individual practice. And I think that there is no question that it is an important piece of the equation. And there's no question that it shapes how we cultivate our sensibilities. And in many ways, from a Jewish perspective, it makes a lot of sense to start there, right? We're about how do we live in the world? How do we cultivate our practices? But if we're going to mitigate the most devastating impacts of the climate crisis in the short time frame that we have, if we had 40 years, we could get there that way, but we don't. And so we need to be taking action and channeling people and mobilizing people towards systemic change. And personal practices like reducing meat consumption and communal practices like greening institutions, very good. And if every single person and institution significantly lowered their carbon footprint, we would not avoid the most catastrophic impacts. It would not be Dayenu. And just by way of example, in the middle of April, when more than half the world was homebound due to the coronavirus, carbon dioxide emissions fell only 17%. The other 83% are embedded in our infrastructure. And to address that, we need to be making changes, cutting demand for and supply for fossil fuel energy, advocating for comprehensive climate policy on the state and federal level, moving our money, changing our political landscape. It's very funny that you said that, Shmuly, because I was going to share one of my favorite quotes from Bill McKibben, the journalist and activist, who says the climate crisis no longer yields to individual actions. There is no way to make the math work one vegan dinner at a time at this point. The most important thing an individual can do is be less of an individual and join movements sharp enough to make change.
Okay, good. I would love to respond to that. Are you done?
Go ahead.
Almost.
Okay, please go ahead.
So we need to not just be focusing on what car do I buy, but what cars are they manufacturing in Detroit? It's not where do I bank or what are the banks that are most invested in fossil fuel and how do we take action on them? And I think, and this is where I'll sort of hand it back to you, Shmuly, but I think that the fossil fuel companies want us to focus on individual practices and individual consumer habits, where they don't want us to be thinking big and systemically. And I think that if we're going to be able to achieve what we need to achieve in terms of ensuring that humanity can continue l'dor v'dor, we need to make sure that the things we are organizing people around and for are actually going to move the needle in the time frame that we have.
Amazing. So I think that's a very compelling case that Rabbi Rosenn makes, and it's one that I find very inspiring and very accurate. And I want to share how in my own narrative, I've come to a slightly different conclusion, which is that I believe that legislative change is incredibly powerful and crucial. And I also believe it leaves us in a very tenuous and flimsy situation when there's not a deeper cultural and spiritual consciousness shift. I think the only way this work is going to be sustained in the world on any of these issues of defending the vulnerable, not to mention defending the planet, is if human beings learn to live on an elevated spiritual consciousness in regards to the other, in regards to responsibility. And so I think that, take just systemic racism as an example. You can pass whatever legislation you want in the 60s. If you don't change the psyche and the soul of the American conscience, it's all going to come back up to surface. And so we can fight this, and then there's an administrative change, and it reverses. The only way we win is if the conscience of every American, the conscience of every human being, or enough of them, is fundamentally shifted from bottom to top. And so I think that something like veganism that actually transforms the being and the family unit and the communal unit in a way that it can't be reversed again, right? And so there's no doubt the easy answer is yes, this is true and this is true. We need a political revolution and a spiritual revolution. But I've come to the conclusion that I'm very grateful for those working on political revolutions, but I want to be on the side of a spiritual revolution that starts person by person, home by home, because I've come to the conclusion that that can sustain the movements longer term.
All right.
So,
Who would like to, okay, Fred, go ahead.
Well, I want to step between two friends and colleagues and say, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim hen. They're both truths here, but add another piece, which is that the work Shmuly is talking about is also instrumental toward the work Jennie is talking about. Because often you need to walk the walk before you talk the talk, right? And it's praxis, it's a dialectic, and one strengthens the other. The more we do on our own, the more we organize, and the more we do out there, the more we come back and recognize the cognitive dissonance between what we're doing out there and our own unsustainable lifestyles. Just want to remind us, others have flagged along the way, the climate communications field, Yale, YPCCC, and others, they talk about 6 Americans profiles, right? So when in answering Hava's initial question about what are the larger stumbling blocks, for some, it's ignorance or it's apathy. For a smaller number, it's avarice and outright lies that then other people buy. There's a growing number of people who get it, and some of them will be motivated by going straight to the legislative and building power, and some will be motivated by starting with the individual actions. And that's a matter of environmental psychology. So I would love to turn this over to Mirele, who is the resident expert on that.
Thank you.
I'm having such a hard time deciding what to say about that. I really recommend that book that I mentioned before by Robert Frank, Under the Influence, Putting Peer Pressure to Work, because he's a behavioral economist, I believe, and he really talks about the fact that at first he just really dismissed the power of individual action until he started looking into the research on it and realized that people taking the individual action, like Rabbi Shmuly is talking about, if they do that, they become much more willing to get involved publicly and to be involved in advocacy. And that's really the connection there. What we know that people make change, and I think this is the other key piece I would just insert in here, people change because of the people around them. It's all about changing social norms. And I think that's where the Jewish community can really make such a huge difference, because we're all about community. That's what we do, right? So if we can change the norms in our communities, we can change the way people behave and the way they get involved. I wanted to just tell one story about that. That this happened with Hurricane Sandy. At the time I was working with the Jewish Greening Fellowship, and we had a fellow who was working with a synagogue who was personally really devastated by Hurricane Sandy. She lived in Belle Harbor, which is on the Barrier Island off the coast of New York. Her home was completely devastated. Her car was ruined. Her parents were living there. They had no heat. There was no way to get off the island because there was no transportation. And her, a few days after the hurricane, I, remembered she lived there, and I gave her a call and I said, Amy, how are you doing? And she said, you're not going to believe this. Our synagogue mobilized. They came out to Belle Harbor. They rescued us. They brought us back to the synagogue. They got us a new car. They got us an apartment, and we opened the synagogue as a warming center. There were weeks, it was weeks where people did not have heat, even on Long Island where they hadn't been flooded out. She said, you're not going to believe this, Mirele, but Hurricane Sandy was the best thing that ever happened to me. And what she experienced there, they call Hurricane Sandy a sneak peek of the future. Now we're seeing it all the time. But what she experienced there was the power of Jewish community. We can get through this if we recognize the power that we have, the love, the compassion, and the community, the mobilization that we can make happen within our communities. And this is borne out by the psychological research, not only by Jewish tradition and heritage.
Great. Yeah, Rabbi Rubenstein, you are the last one to answer that question, and then we'll pose the final question.
I want to say, so perhaps controversially, that more than any of the industries want us to argue about individual action versus collective action, or want us to focus on individual action, they want us to argue about individual action versus collective action. And when I think about the challenges to environmental activism within the Jewish community, particularly within the Jewish community, I think about the ways that we have historically responded to fear and to threat. And particularly we as the Jewish community, there has been, and this may be a controversial thing to name, a focus on shoring up our own safety and shoring up our own safety through accumulating wealth and accumulating portable wealth. And Jews are very invested in capitalism. Many Jews right now in the market existing as it currently exists. And the market existing as it currently exists is one of the huge barriers to meaningful environmental change. And that needs to be said, and it needs to be dug at its root. A growing market cannot exist. An endlessly growing market cannot exist on a finite planet. We know this. And so the Jewish impulse to find security in capitalism, and one of the earlier speakers mentioned epigenetics. And so our epigenetic tendency to leave when things get rough as a migrant people, Dr. Samuelson, you mentioned the unnatural Jew essay, right? We're not tied down anywhere. We're not rooted anywhere. If things get tough, the smartest among us notice the signs and we pick up and go. So, you know, what does that mean in a crisis where there is no other planet to go to? What does that mean in a crisis where the crisis is enveloping the whole world and we cannot find our own safety just by pulling up stakes and leaving? And I think those are the two. This is why I tried to cut in before Mirele spoke, because I think these are really two huge psychological challenges, probably for all humans, but I particularly noticed for the Jewish community.
Yes, indeed. And I think that's a very good segue to the last question, which I will just pose quickly, and then we'll open it up to discussion from the audience or with the audience. In a nutshell, are you optimistic or are you pessimistic? Do you see possibilities, opportunities, or do you see systemic structures that cannot really be transformed, like capitalism? So who would like to take it? Way to the future. What should be the way to the future? How to think about it? And by future, I'm talking about the next 10 years, because we are in a very short window of opportunity. So maybe Rabbi Rosenn will go to you, because you have the most, I guess, articulated position on that spot.
So I want to just raise one other challenge, and then I'll speak to the hope, are we hopeful question. Which we've talked about some, but I think it bears mentioning apropos of what you were just saying, Ruhi, which is that I think that people are afraid to face this. I think that it goes to the 6 categories that you were talking about, Fred, but I think that one of the reasons we find people don't engage in significant action is not because they're not concerned, but to look at it is so painful. It's like too much for our souls to take in, that we could really be facing this level of devastation, what that means for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren. And so we look away, we get busy, we watch Netflix, we take care of our families, we do all the things that we do. And so I think part of our response collectively as a religious community is to support people in that confrontation with the truth. And the other dimension of Dayenu's work, which I haven't really talked so much about, but I'll just mention, is piloting workshops in communities that we're actually doing right now called Confronting the Climate Crisis and Cultivating Spiritual Courage, to give people and communities spaces to begin to grapple with the emotional and spiritual issues that the crisis raises. And we need that both lishma, for its own sake, it's part of what it means to be communities of meaning, and I believe that it's part of growing a Jewish climate movement, because part of how you live in the face of it is by acting. I guess I'll respond to your question about hope by just saying a word about why we did name the organization Dayenu. And I love, Ruhi, the word that you offered on that, on the word Dayenu. We, as most people know, Dayenu is this song of gratitude, right? We sing it every year at the Passover Seder as we retell the story of our journey from slavery to freedom and all that God did for us. And we say, if God had taken us out of Egypt and not given us the Torah, Dayenu, it would have been enough. But it also means we've had enough. We've had enough destruction. We've had enough valuing fossil fuel companies over human life. We've had enough letting the impacts fall on disproportionately on Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. Dayenu, enough. But here's where the double entendre comes in, because it also means we have enough. We have what we need to confront the climate crisis and move towards solutions. We have the resources, we have the policy rubrics and the technology. We have what we need so that everyone can have enough. So now I really believe is the time for us to join together in this urgent and sacred work together so that everyone can have enough.
Nice. Yes. Who of the panelists would like to address the future in terms of how you position yourself, in terms of your attitude, your posture toward this very difficult, urgent and sacred task? I like it very much, but can you really do it all? Or do you get depressed, for example, or dispirited about the difficulty of it? How do you keep going? So who would like to respond to that?
I would like to respond. I first want to say, I actually don't think capitalism is a system incapable of transformation. I think it has radically transformed in the past 100 years. it radically transformed in the past 500 years. And there are other models of capitalism possible, including models in Islamic law and in Jewish law that could be very much more life-giving than the model we're currently living. I am not optimistic. Judaism doesn't charge us to be optimistic, but I am hopeful in the sense of aware of the ways that things can shift radically. And that if we manage to, first of all, reject this consistent framing of climate as a partisan issue, and if we can do what so many others on this panel and before have already spoken about, really integrating climate work with all of the other urgent justice demands of this moment, that things could shift very suddenly in terms of the popular spiritual consciousness that Shmuly was describing, as well as the policy necessary changes that Rabbi Rosenn was talking about. One of my mentors, Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum, who really grew up in the LGBTQ rights movement, says frequently that activists always underestimate what can be accomplished in 1 year. Sorry, activists always overestimate what can be accomplished in 1 year and underestimate what can be accomplished in 10. And so I think one pitfall about the climate conversation is that it always involves these deadlines. We need to hit this benchmark by this year, or this will be lost. And we know, as I've said already, so much is lost. We're going to keep passing those deadlines and meeting them or not meeting them. And people are already dying and species are already going extinct. And yet life will continue and our tasks will continue. So I can't be optimistic, but I can be committed to this idea of chiyuv, of like, we have obligations as humans, we have obligations as Jews, and we have spiritual practices that keep us honest to our obligations. And that's how we move forward.
Yes, well said. Yeah, go ahead.
Both of the things I wanted to say follow up on Ruhi's points. One about kinder capitalism as a Jewish image. We cannot let this conference go by without saying the word Shemitah, because the sabbatical year encapsulates so many of these teachings that where social justice and environmental sustainability and spirituality all connect with each other. And of course, it's starting this Rosh Hashanah, just as we'll be coming out of COVID into a time that should celebrate that. I'm vaguely optimistic because we've learned some lessons from COVID that we can now apply to scale on the yet greater crisis ahead, when enough people believe the science to make changes against an unseen enemy and quickly pivot. The other piece, though, is that hope is kind of a funny and wan and fuzzy, vague thing. People get mixed up between digital and analog, right? And this is building on Ruhi's penultimate point, that the climate is not digital, where things are okay, they're okay, they're okay, and then suddenly it's game over, right? There's an infinite number of points between here and utter catastrophe. And it's already too late for many individuals, many species, many ecosystems, even many peoples. And more suffering lies ahead and has been locked in by 100-year endurance of carbon in the atmosphere. But our actions and our advocacy right now will make a small but measurable difference for those in the future for whom it is not yet too late. So we need to channel what Dr. King called the fierce urgency of now, Davka, because it's now plus a century before all the good work we do yields its sacred fruits. But if we wait, then we're violating every principle we have. If we mobilize and we do it together, we can do great things.
Well said. All right, Rabbi Yanklowitz. Oh, Mirele, you wanted to say something to that point?
Yeah,
go ahead.
I want to say two things. First is just the whole idea of tipping points. I'm very taken with that now. You know, we really don't know when the tipping point is going to happen and we're going to get the political change we need. And it's going to happen very suddenly. And I think we're seeing a lot of movement and change now. And that is giving me some hope that things are really going to change in big ways. And we just don't know when that's going to happen. So every person that gets involved, everything we do, could be the thing that gets us to that tipping point. So that's one thing. The other thing I wanted to say is a couple of years ago, I was invited to give an environmental justice tour to a group of teenagers that were at a summer program at the Jewish Theological Seminary. I tried to get them the appropriate person to do that, but they weren't available, so I was drafted. We walked around Harlem and we looked at, a lot of the waste facilities that were there. And, it's really a sacrifice zone, as we talked about earlier today. And then we came to the roof of the North River Water Treatment Plant. It's a sewage treatment plant that was imposed on that neighborhood that should have been in a wealthy white neighborhood further south, but was imposed on Harlem. We stood on the roof of that and we talked about the Hudson River. And I told these teenagers about how polluted the Hudson River had been, and that people in the 60s in the Fishermen's Association, and Pete Seeger with his, got that sailing ship and started educating people about the Hudson River, and the clean water laws were passed. And today the Hudson River is much cleaner than it was before, and fish are coming back and people can swim in it. And at the end of this whole program, I asked the teenagers, what did they learn from this program? And they all said what they learned was that things can get better. They said, no one ever tells us that things can actually get better. All we hear about is the problems and how bad things are. And the research shows that what motivates people is hope. That we are not, our psychology is not constructed to deal with a challenge like climate change. It's so complex, it's so overwhelming. It feels like something that we cannot do individually. What does motivate people is a feeling of hope. And I'll just end by saying that Jews are also great at hope. We are always looking toward the future. We know, as Rabbi Rosenn said earlier, we've changed, we've adapted, we've overcome challenges, and that's something that we can contribute to this discussion.
Terrific. Rabbi Yanklowitz, please
I'll be brief.
And then we'll open it up to conversation from the audience.
Great. Yeah, sure. I'll be brief. So building off what Reb Fred said around Shemitah, I think this conversation also can't happen without talking about Shabbos. We need Shabbos for the world. Shabbos for the world is one of our greatest exports. And if we transform the notion of Shabbos as a sustainability practice, as a global practice, I think it could be so deeply transformative, not only because of its actualization, but because, like Dr. Goldstein was saying, that hope, how transformative hope can be for behavioral change. So too, that engaging in a system, a web of meaning, a system of meaning that can sustain that work, that to build a sustainability practice around a theology like this. And so I very much follow Rabbi Nachman that despair is the greatest sin. Ein yesh be'olam, there is no despair ever, and that we live with emunah. And emunah doesn't mean that God's going to make everything okay. Emunah means I trust in the path of integrity that I walk on, and I trust that if I continue to walk on that path of integrity, that I'm doing what I need to do in the world. And so the last thing I just want to say is that I think the question of hope also lies in the power of love. Do we believe in love? Because if we believe a parent loves a child and a grandparent loves a grandchild, then they care about their future. And love in Judaism, I think, is an action, not an emotion. Oh, actually, you wrote the book on love. I can't say much about love in front of you, Professor Samuelson. But one of the Jewish manifestations of Hava is behavioral. And if we love our children, our grandchildren, then what will we do to fight for them?
Yes, I did not write a book on love, but a book on Osher, which is really about human flourishing. Okay. So actually, as a person who studies the Aristotelian tradition, there's a lot of deep wisdom in that tradition, which actually corresponds to a lot of things in the rabbinic tradition itself. Let's see what the audience is suggesting to us. All right, let's see if I can read it from, I don't see the beginning of the question here. All right, so the first question from Paul Fieldstone seems to focus on the problem as created by modern scientific technology. And that we need to spend more time, and we have not in this conference paid attention to technological innovation. So would an effort to educate the public at large on this approach lead to more constructive solutions? Who would like to take that question? So far, nobody. Well, it's an yeah. Go ahead, Ellen. Maybe you can unmute yourself and you can take that. And then Peter, you would like to respond. That's good. So let's hear from Ellen Bernstein.
So for me, in doing all the work of illuminating the ecological dimensions in Judaism and having that become more central in Jewish life and synagogue life, one of my thoughts was always about raising Jewish kids who would take environment seriously in a myriad kinds of ways, including becoming environmental scientists or, developing technological solutions. So for me, again, it's that inspiration that needs to be nurtured throughout Jewish life that we're cultivating our young people as well.
Great. Peter, do you want to respond to that question, or you have another question? I cannot hear you. I'm sorry.
I'm muted. I'm depressed. Can you hear me now?
Barely.
Yeah,
You need to go up a bit.
Not my wife's computer. So I have to talk right next to it. I'm depressed not because of climate change. If I were to cut you all off from the internet, from newspapers, from all the chatter, would you have noticed climate change? The answer is no. There are things called natural fluctuations. Not every storm, not every flood, not every hurricane, not every forest fire has anything to do with climate change. And what I find very disturbing is this idea that this whole technological infrastructure that has been built up over centuries is some evil thing that is doing bad things to everybody. As I said before, it's what ended slavery. It's what ended servitude. You should read Smill's book. It's kind of, we leap in a car and we turn a key and we have at our command 100 to 200 horses. Now you go up to King Solomon and say, poor people even have this. He would laugh at you. I mean, these are incredible things. And, to give all that up for a hypothetical, it just seems so bizarre to me. And yeah, there is some effect. Maybe we can live with it. As I said, the effects are concentrated in the polar regions. Maybe that's not so bad. And if we're going to have a technology, and I talked a bit about that, it better work. And, it's not a matter of telling the government, give the oil companies a hard time or whatever. So that's why I'm depressed, to hear things like I heard this afternoon.
Okay, thank you, Peter.
Yeah.
Let me pose another question from Bob Schloss. Given how much of the Talmud deals with fair employment, fair business practices, fair protection of property, should the Jewish community be doing much more than we have already done to support ESG, which stands for Environment, Social Governance, Investing Movement? And should the Jewish community make this apply not just to large businesses, but also to small businesses? So who would like to handle that kind of social political challenge? Yes, go ahead.
I just say very quickly, because I know Mirele and Ruhi are both very deeply in the finance piece, so amen to that. For Peter's point, your earlier presentation was certainly provocative, and you know the science better than I. From what I know, you are in a minority of atmospheric experts, but nonetheless, moral questions come into play when the data points are at all in doubt, even if they're 97% settled, right? And the tradition of machloket in our, says even safek pikuach nefesh, even the possible harm to life, that you don't need an expert, and you err on the side of precaution. And that, of course, the precautionary principle from Deuteronomy 22:8. When you put up a new house, you put a parapet around the roof. And it doesn't say only a roof at less than 20% angle where you're likely to have kids congregate on it. And it doesn't say only a roof in a neighborhood where an empirical trend has been proven because 3 children already fell off the roof. Davka, you build the damn roof because you play it safe. And so we need to acknowledge all that history has brought us. And we also need to acknowledge all of the very real and frightening possibilities in front of us based on different interpretations of the data. And here we have a bunch of amazing practitioners who are all trying to create a thriving future that celebrates the best of what was, but also positions us as well as possible for the future.
Can I reply to that?
Quickly,
It's
yes.
a cautionary principle which has led to the death of nuclear power, which is the one viable option for greatly reducing CO2 emissions in power gen. So, everything's a trade-off. There's benefits and their costs. And you've got to kind of weigh one against the other. If you're going to freak out about nuclear waste, but don't care about possible climate change, then keep burning the coal. If you're going to worry about climate change, then you don't have the luxury of freaking out about nuclear waste. It's really that simple. If we want to live in a world where we have no impact, then you have a very much reduced population, and they all live on nice tropical islands which require no heating and cooling, and they just lie in bed all day and wait for fruit to drop into their mouths. Anything beyond that, you're going to need energy.
But let's go back to the question that was posed on the fair business practices, fair protection of property. Anybody from the panel would like to respond to that question?
At the risk of straying out of my lane, although my husband works in Jewish finance, so I do have a good deal of exposure to this, I would say that ESG is a good start. It's not enough. It's tinkering. The way that our market is still, the way that capitalism is currently regulated or unregulated in this moment in the US is still that most corporations are legally required to do whatever will benefit their financial bottom line and their shareholders the most. And that benefit is defined exclusively in terms of maximizing profits. Now, B corporations are a fairly recent innovation that changed the definition of those benefits and changed the definition of who are relevant stakeholders. So I think a movement to make the norm in the financial markets be something like B corporations would be a very effective and interesting movement. But I think as long as we're looking at voluntary tinkering within the current legal frameworks of American capitalism, we're not doing enough.
All right, yes.
Okay, well, I love what Ruhi said, and I just want to say that the organization her husband works for is J-Lens, and everyone should look it up and get involved. There's not one thing that's going to solve this problem. Is so complex that we need to attack it from all different directions. So taking it from the, the sublime to the ridiculous, or whatever the expression is, I'd like to talk about our Rabbi Fred and I, our congregation, and what we're doing. We wanted to get our members to understand more about how the capitalist system works and how we can advocate and make a difference by using our money. We are all implicated in this system. And we partnered with Green America, and we have a campaign going in our congregation now to get our congregants to take the first step to breaking up with the big banks. The top banks in the United States are heavily invested in fossil fuel infrastructure and financing that infrastructure. And the first step people can take is to stop using a credit card with those banks and switch to a socially responsible credit card. This is a small action, and our congregation is not going to change the capitalist system. But what this does, going back to what we talked about before, is people are becoming educated about the impact of their money. And I'll just say that I had a long conversation with a guy who had worked for Wells Fargo for his whole career. And it was a very education. He said to me, banks don't do anything unless it's going to help their profits. And I said, well, actually, that's not true. They're worried about their reputations. And we know that that's how apartheid, that was a big part of the campaign against apartheid, and it had an impact. And we can do the same thing. So just to say, that's something you can do in your community.
Great. We have two more. Rabbi Rosenn, you wanted to refer to?
Oh, very, very quickly. I'll just say that when we think about things like the financing of the fossil fuel industry, to Mirele's point, there are a lot of ways to cut it. So there's your personal practices. What are you invested in? What's your community invested in? What's your Jewish institution invested in? And then there are whole campaigns like the Stop the Money Pipeline campaign, which is oriented at the banks and insurance companies and financial management companies that support and prop up the fossil fuel industry. And so there's actions that communities can then take in partnership and in collaboration on those agencies. And I think, to the bottom line, we're in a moment where the fossil fuel industry is actually in a point of weakening. So I think that bottom line question is actually starting to come onto sort of our side of the ledger, which makes this a particularly ripe moment. I would say that's in tension with the fact that with the economic situation and people feeling so vulnerable, there's more hesitancy among some people and institutions to make these changes. But I think over the long, sort of looking forward, I actually think this is going to become a really important lever, and one that our organizing and communities should be thinking more about.
I just have to add to that. Thank you so much, Jennie, for explaining that. And I think that this is something that Jewish communities have, I've always been told my Jewish community will never do that. We have donors. If one donor is going to be alienated, we're never going to make a change in our institutional investing. But if we start with the individual action, I really believe that that's where we can reach a tipping point when people understand what this is all about, and there's a call for it in Jewish institutions. That's when we'll be able to do it.
Thank you. Well, we have two more questions. One concerns, actually, it's to Rabbi Yanklowitz particularly. I don't see him on the screen, but I hope he's still with us.
I'm still here.
You are here, great. So the question to you was, can you address dairy, or I guess not using dairy, as it relates to soy or almond milk, and what it takes to produce alternative quote unquote dairy products?
Well, I've done that research. I don't have it at my fingertips, but from what that research has shown me is that it's far better environmentally to be on soy milk or almond milk than dairy milk. And whoever said that, you're welcome to email me. I'll shoot it to you, and I can send you some of that research.
It's from Bill Sy, but actually, as far as my knowledge is concerned, actually the almond, growing almond is very intensive in terms of water, right? Water consumption. Right. So environmentally, it actually is a big challenge. Maybe Ellen could say more about it. She may know more about, almond milk and what it takes in terms of the soil. The last question we have on the Q&A is, first of all, starting with a comment. It's from Alon Rab, and he says, thank you all for a wonderful and inspiring conference. Also begins with a point that he's a vegan, and he agrees with Rabbi Yanklowicz's call. But another gigantic environmental footprint is actually the issue of pu'uvu. In other words, the commandment to increase and be fruitful. So how should we think about overpopulation from a Judaic perspective. Who would like to take that? Rabbi Yanklowitz, you want to, since you're on the
this
screen
is kind of where
already?
my interests intersect a little bit, in that I'm a big advocate for fostering and adopting children who are vulnerable and neglected, and I think we need to promote this path more often. Not that it's a replacement, but I think that we might consider how more families, rather than having more children, given the overpopulation concerns, can consider fostering and adopting as well.
All right. Who would like to respond to the question of overpopulation? It is a challenge, especially if we recall the first lecture in the morning by Roger Gottlieb speaking about the Holocaust. So clearly for many Jews, one of the lessons of the Holocaust is precisely the need to have large families, precisely that. So it's very hard to tell Jews do not increase and multiply given the loss of the Holocaust. So who would like to respond to that? Yes, Fred, go ahead.
Very quickly, like with vegan diet, this is an intensely personal area. We have to be incredibly conscious of not trampling on women's freedoms and reproductive rights in conversation. And there is a collective responsibility question to how many children one gives birth to, and that is inescapable, and that is contradictory in some ways with halakha and Jewish tradition, and also with the more modern tradition that says we have to make up for 6 million. Of course, so many groups would be able to invoke that loophole of we have oppression and loss in our history, and therefore, right? And so it becomes a little bit of a tragedy of the commons. There's a precedent, I believe it was Hillel in the early conversations about this said, 1 boy and 1 girl is sufficient. There's a more modern version that simply says, this is the first of 613 commandments that we have collectively fulfilled, right? Arthur Waskow, among others, brings this Torah forward, that we can just say we are collectively Yotze. Almost 8 billion people, and most of the biomass of the earth now made after in our image, that is, if that's not, milu et haaretz v'kivshuha, what is? So I close with a piece of wisdom from a fellow environmental activist and UU minister and folk singer, Fred Small. Too many people having too many babies. Got to love them babies, but there's too many people having too many babies. Got to love them babies, but it's out of control.
All right. I'm told that our time is running out. I would like to thank all of you for really inspiring contribution. It was full of passion, full of compassion, full of creativity, full of responsibility. And that brings me kind of to the last question that we have in the chat. The question was, to what extent humans really are the responsible agent for the coming of the Anthropocene? So we refer to the Anthropocene early on in the day. We are not going to be able to take it all the way right now, but I am really very happy and satisfied that we put together this conference that enabled us to bring scientists and theologians and Judaica scholars and ethicists and activists and educators and psychologists all to work together. So with the spirit of hope and optimism that you all shared with us in this session, let's move forward and let's try to make the world a better place